Our guest tonight is quite plainly the most courageous and the most dedicated lawyer in Canada to the cause of freedom. You would think that there might be many interested and ambitious lawyers who would look for a difficult case to make their name, to become famous, to challenge laws that are certainly very repressive. But when when Ernst Zundel was charged and when James Keegstra was charged, they looked around and lo and behold, there were no lawyers. Nobody, the length and breadth of this land, would mount a spirited defense for either man. There were perhaps lawyers to be had who might fight on very narrow legalistic grounds. But to mount a spirited defense all the way, there was not a single lawyer from St. John's, Newfoundland, to Victoria, British Columbia, with the one exception in Victoria, British Columbia, of Doug Christie. I think this says more about the cowardice and the wimpishness of the Canadian people than many other statistics or facts that any speaker could give you tonight. It's really a very, very sad indictment, and certainly makes me feel that we may be living in the land of the lout and the coward. Doug Christie has done no more and no less than any man accused should be able to expect of a lawyer. And it is so very sad that only one man in this country was prepared to fight for these two men who have been victimized for doing no more than any man or woman here should have the right to do, and that is to think and to express what they think, right, wrong, or indifferent. Doug Christie is a graduate of the University of British Columbia, and he's practiced law in British Columbia and continues to do so today. He's accredited to practice before the bars of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and I'm sure, as you all know, here in Ontario as well. He is famous recently for his defense of James Keegstra and Ernst Zundel, and prior to that, and on an ongoing basis, he is still the leader of the Western Canada Concept, which certainly created a good deal of worry for the Trudeau government during the days of the National Energy Program and almost the complete economic victimization of Western Canada, particularly the province of Alberta. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome here a real hero of freedom, Doug Christie of Victoria.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here and speak to you tonight about a subject that should be of interest and concern to everybody, basically the freedom to learn to speak and to think, and to, having thought, speak out what you believe. This freedom is in serious jeopardy in Canada today. Last weekend I was in Los Angeles and was receiving the award known as the George Orwell Freedom of Speech Award, and it occurred to me that one of the things George Orwell was concerned about was the realization that those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. The realization that that brings home to people today is that George Orwell wasn't speaking about fantasy land. He wasn't speaking about something that will yet occur in some distant place. He's speaking about something that is happening in Canada today and is happening around us right now. And that means that we are not confronted with an academic debate about a problem that has no real meaning. We're confronted with a very real crisis that you and I are obliged to address and respond to immediately. It isn't something we can ignore and hope someone else will solve. It isn't something we can say is for the next generation to deal with. It is something that we must deal with now, and we must deal with action in a constructive manner. The fact is, the greatest difficulty about finding out what is right and what is wrong today around us, you and me, the difficulty in knowing what is right is the difficulty in knowing what is. What really is and what really was. What is today and what was in history is a very important part of finding out what the future should be and how we should be in the future. The people today who want to control the understanding of what is and who want to control the present as a result, have sought to do so by defining history and making their view the only legal view in history. This means that tyranny of the mind is growing in Canada that is not likely to disappear without a very serious fight, because it hasn't happened overnight, and it isn't going to disappear quickly. The reason why it has arisen in this country is very simply the apathy, the indifference, and the complacency and the ignorance of people who believe that it doesn't matter what I think and it doesn't matter what I do. Freedom was fought for some time ago and we don't need to keep fighting for it now. The fact is that if freedom was fought for in the past, it is not guaranteed in the present, and it is most certainly not guaranteed in the future. There is in the world two basic ideological forces at work. The force of, on the one hand, the belief in a divine creator and a belief in the freedom of the human being to find and to ultimately achieve the truth through a voluntary pursuit of the truth, that nobody ought to monopolize the means of information. That, on the one hand, is confronted with a system, on the other hand, that has no belief in truth. There is no truth. To the communist Marxist dialectic, there is no truth. There is simply the political expedient of controlling the masses to the production of the greatest value to the state. And therefore we are in an ideological war which is no different than it was since 1917. It is no different than it was in the 19th century. It is the conflict between a belief in man as a divine creation and a belief in man as an instrument of state and an instrument of government control. We therefore are not wise to ignore that the growth of the belief in the power of the state to control the human mind is really the growth of communistic ideology in Canada. We cannot avoid that realization. We should not pretend that it does not exist. We should not for a moment think that that war, which under circumstances in another part of the world in 1917 overthrew a government, and from that time on has been growing throughout the world, is an ideology that intends to bury everyone who thinks for themselves. It will bury them either in the control and the fear dictated by the state through the law of this country, or it will bury them in a form of revolution. And it is my intention, and it's the intention of others who believe in the value of freedom, the dignity and worth of the human individual, the value of the human spirit's pursuit of truth, to defend that, to advance that, and to fight for it, and to never, never surrender. In Canada today, there is the first step towards totalitarian thought control in the banning of books. This is a book. It is written, obviously, in the United States. It's called The Great Holocaust Trial. It is a book about the trial of Ernst Zundel. I happen to know, having read many of the books that have been written, many of the stories that have been put forward, that they were, in the main, totally biased and totally slanted. This book, like many others, does indeed have a bias. It is a bias in favor of the freedom and tolerance that should be extended to Ernst Zundel. If anyone in Toronto has stood and paid the price for their convictions and deserves our support and deserves the understanding and the commitment to fight on the side of that person most surely is Ernst Zundel. I have had the privilege in the last 2 years of defending two of the finest gentlemen I have ever met. Ernst Zundel and James Keegstra have had many reasons to see fault in many of the weaknesses that I as a lawyer may have had, but never once did they ever criticize me. They always maintained a deep understanding of the commitment I had to them and to freedom, and they realized that though we may not be perfect, we will fight the best fight we can, with the highest principles we know, with the commitment that we've all shared to both freedom and truth. And in that regard, I can tell you that no lawyer was ever able to defend a finer client or clients than those two men. I would not be criticized in any way were I defending rapists, child molesters, thieves, or frauds. That is quite legitimate for lawyers. But I have been accused of many things, many things, because I defended Ernst, Zundel, and James Keegstra. And it seems to me that's indicative of the real threat to those who wish a tyrannical control over the human mind. That they don't mind frauds, they don't mind thieves, they don't mind any form of perversion or other corruption. But what they mind most of all are the thoughts that could undermine their power. And consequently, those two men, James Keegstra and Ernst Zundel, were attacked in the media like no other two Canadians were ever attacked. And that obviously demonstrates that the purposes that are being pursued are not the good and the stability of society, and they're not the ultimate goal of attaining a wide dissemination of ideas so that truth might prevail. Their goal is the control of the public mind and the perception of history in Canada. Yes, it's true that he who controls the present controls the past in a totalitarian state. The question that I ask of you tonight is, do you wish to live in a totalitarian state of mind control? Many of you have come from countries that are now under the domination of the Soviet Union. Many of you know well, and I need not tell you, the price that is paid by those who have fought for freedom there in the past and are still in many small ways trying. But I need not tell you either that in the present situation in Canada there is a movement afoot to see to it that any of you who survived the onslaught of communism in those countries and who happen to be probably a critic of the Soviet system will very soon be subject to another form of terror and tyranny in this country in the form of the results of the Deschenes Commission and the introduction into Canada of Soviet evidence. I have in my hands a copy of the judgment of the Deschenes Commission, Mr. Justice Deschenes, when he decided to introduce and permit the introduction into Canadian courts of evidence derived through the helpful advice of the Soviet Union. And he decided that it was quite all right to introduce Soviet evidence, that the objections made to it by many who felt that it was unjust were themselves unjustified. I find it interesting to note that he gave as his reasons a clear indication of who was for it and who was against it. He gave us a very clear indication of who opposed the idea of Soviet evidence being introduced into Canadian courts and who was against it. He said, arguments against introducing Soviet evidence came from the Baltic Federation in Canada, from the Information and Anti-Defamation Commission of the Ukrainian-Canadian Committee, from the Committee of Ukrainian-Canadian Political Prisoners, from the Ukrainian-Canadian Students' Union, from the Ottawa Estonian Society, from Yuri Shimko, MPP, from David Kilgore, MP, from Las Leviat, from Romain Serban, from Bogdan Dudka, from Michael Maranchuk, from Ron Vestokas, from Vidas Zalnierionis, sorry about that, from Leonard Lucas, from Y.R. Botiuk on behalf of the Brotherhood of the Veterans of the 1st Division of the Ukrainian National Army in Canada, and from John Sapinka. Obviously, more than one group is represented by those people. They said that the Commission should not receive Soviet evidence because Soviet-supplied evidence cannot be trusted, because of fabrication, intimidation, denial of right to independent counsel, lack of full cross-examination, and general disregard for the principles of fundamental justice. They also said that access to Soviet archives is severely limited, and when it is, not totally prevented. The same observation applies to access to sites of crimes and to potentially exculpatory witnesses. The use of Soviet-supplied evidence would constitute a mockery of justice and represent the worst form of McCarthyist witch hunts. The USSR places no values on the rights of the individual. It is intent on attacking any ethnic group which opposes the Soviet state. By traveling to the USSR, the Commission would legitimize the political claims of the USSR on the Balkan states and the Ukraine. And of course, it's the official policy of the government of Canada that the Soviet claims to the Baltic states, are invalid. By the same token, the Commission, they said, would give legitimacy to the Soviet legal system, which is but a pawn in the hands of the Soviet government. And they also said it would be ludicrous to foresee trials in Canada which would depend on a wholesale obtaining of Soviet evidence. Contrasted with those views, contrasted with those reasons, The Commission heard from another group, or groups, the League of Human Rights of B'nai Brith, Canada, the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai Brith, New York, from Saul Littman, from David Mattis, from Kenneth Narvey of the North American Jewish Students Network, from Irwin Kotler of the Canadian Jewish Congress. They had one point of view. They took the position that the Commission should go to the Soviet Union and should receive Soviet evidence. They said the Commission must go where the evidence is. The documents are in Soviet archives or German archives seized by the Soviets. Eyewitnesses are for the most part in the countries where crimes were allegedly committed. Victims of the Holocaust should not be deliberately excluded as witnesses and thus doubly victimized. Soviet motives should not invalidate Eastern European evidence. Soviet-supplied evidence was used and accepted by the courts at Nuremberg and in the Rauka case in Canada. And there is no known instance in Europe or North America of a Soviet-supplied document having been falsified or by an Eastern Bloc witness having perjured himself. They went on to say, use of evidence from Eastern European countries will not legitimize the political system of the Soviet Union or its legal system. Opposition to the use of Soviet-supplied evidence is a declaration of non-confidence in the Canadian judicial system and its ability to sort out good evidence from bad evidence. First of all, the Canadian Commission will not be allowed to go where it likes, and the Commissioner himself, in order to avoid a confrontation with the Soviet system, will send his deputies. Whereas he might be confronted with a difficult situation, his deputies are expected to have greater power than he has. Figure that one out if you can. It's obvious to me, it's obvious to anyone who thinks about it, that the reasons given for going to the Soviet Union are far less valid and far less accurate than the reasons given against going to the Soviet Union for evidence. But guess where they're going? Guess where they've already gone? And realize first and foremost that what we have is an ideological struggle between freedom on the one hand and state control and terror, state terror on the other. We live in a state where weak and cowardly corrupted politicians in Canada will sell out anyone, anywhere, anytime, to the highest bidder, to the Soviet Union or to anyone else, to the destruction of freedom that we should be considering now is our most sacred and solemn duty to preserve. It is disgusting to realize that the Progressive Conservative Party and the Liberal Party and the NDP Party all unanimously agreed in a very brief time to do two significant things in Canada. When the court struck down the power to ban books as being beyond the jurisdiction of the simple customs inspector at the border to decide what was obscene or immoral, within less than 10 minutes, every single member of all the parties agreed to amend the law and make it possible for them to do exactly the same thing by another means. And within the same period of time, they have in effect agreed to establish the Deschenes Commission, to maintain it, and to extend its mandate, in spite of the realization that the very basic reason why the Commission was formed, from the institution of Saul Littman's letter of false news to the Government of Canada about the existence and the presence, or likely presence, of Dr. Joseph Mengele in Canada, it was well known and has been known for a long time that that is totally untrue, and he has now even admitted it. He's admitted, in fact, purveying what I suggest to you was false news. And he has been charged by someone in this room for doing so, and I commend that person for charging him. What I have to say to you ultimately is this. There is a solution to this problem. It lies within you and me to support every single person who is A, under attack, or B, fighting for freedom by defending someone else or some principle of freedom. It means simply that you and I should join, support, and encourage every group that is fighting for freedom and truth. We should consistently rally around the League of Rights that Mr. Jürgen Neumann, Mr. Ernst, Zundel, Mr. James Keegstra, because they are the targets today, and we will be, if we do not defend them, the targets tomorrow. That's why it didn't take any great length of time for me to figure out that my best commitment, my best hope for the future of freedom for myself and others, was to come to the defense of these people immediately, not to count the cost, not to look over my shoulder and see what would be done to me for doing it, because if I wait now, then I will be getting it far worse and with far less support in the future. And you should know that too. You should know that you cannot abdicate your responsibility to defend them, right? Because if you do, one by one, every single human being that thinks and every single human being who fights and speaks out will be eliminated. And if they are, nobody will defend you. Remember that tomorrow. Remember that tonight. When you go out of here, and if you don't help Ernst Zundel, if you don't help him, then tomorrow you will be weaker, and you will know in your heart that you are a coward. There's one thing about a particular group of people. They may be few, but they stick together. They may be few, but if one of them is attacked, they're all attacked. Do you know who I mean? You must realize that in a free society, there can be vicious groups that do vicious things. I'm not here to be vicious. Neither are you. We're here to defend the right to think, the right to speak, and the right to be free. And it isn't necessary for us to adopt viciousness, but it is necessary for us to learn the meaning of commitment. Then and only then is there any hope for freedom. It isn't news to point out to you that books such as Legends of Our Time by Elie Wiesel are distributed in Canada. It isn't news to hear that he says on page 177 that every Jew somewhere in his being should set apart a zone of hate, healthy virile hate, for what the German personifies and for what persists in the German. That isn't news to you. And it isn't banned in Canada. It isn't prosecuted in Canada because you don't do anything about it. It is also known to you that Barbara Meal, in an article that was given to me tonight, said something very similar. You know and I know that on April the 15th, 1985, she said, in regard to Mr. Zundel, that what must have it been like for Zundel, a German child growing up in the end of the Second World War, with every radio station, newspaper, and history book telling him he came from a race of hideous, bloody murderers. The fact is, he did. That isn't prosecuted as hatred or promoting hatred. So obviously we have an obvious instance, two of them at least, of the most blatant selectiveness in prosecution. That's why a book like this is illegal. That would get a man in this country 15 months in jail for promoting by simply distributing free of charge. That is the instrument of 15 months imprisonment. And if you and I will tolerate the public ignorance of the need for freedom, then a great many more people will go to jail. And I suppose in time, those of us who dare to speak out, one by one, will be the people who go to jail. And I suppose in the Soviet Union, they don't put everybody in jail. I was amused to find that Lech Walesa was charged, you see, with defaming the socialist state when he said that the recent elections did not have the public support that the government said they did. I was further interested when I found out that the maximum penalty for him doing that was 2 years in prison. You might find it interesting to know that the maximum penalty for the Section 177 offense is 2 years in prison, which is publishing false news damaging to, racial and social harmony? Well, what's the difference between that and 2 years for publishing news that is damaging to the socialist state? What is the difference between the Polish law and the Canadian law? We have the same bland, gray bureaucrats administer it. The same corrupt politicians support it. So what's the difference? Well, I suppose the difference is they don't have the gutless Polish people who will take it. They seem to have a will to fight at times. We, on the other hand, what have you done? Have you written to your member of Parliament? Have you told them you don't like banned books? You don't like a list of books that can and cannot be read? You should ask him for the list and find out how many books are on it. You should get involved now, as I said before, in supporting every organization that stands for freedom and demands the right to think. We have a docile, servile, totally controlled media. It's not a great deal different than it is in Poland. It's just a slightly different message. I was interested to find that Lech Walesa was fortunate. All he had to do was say he didn't intend to defame the Polish socialist state, and they dropped the charges. You know why? Do you know why? Because the Polish socialist communist government was afraid of what the Polish people would say and what the Polish people would do. But who needs to worry about what we in Canada will do in the face of the same kind of tyranny? Who? Well, you and I must make the government of Canada aware that we do not tolerate the destruction of freedom for Ernst Zundel, for James Keegstra, or for anyone else who peacefully promotes their personal opinions. And I don't want, nor should you want, a judge to decide who is right and who is wrong in terms of opinions. It is not possible for a court to decide what is historical truth, in my opinion. It is not right or just that society should establish a government-controlled censor of what books should be legitimately read by adults in this or any country. And it is therefore our duty to make the people who have the power to decide aware that we will work against them. We will find candidates who support freedom, and we will politically support them with money, with time, and with work. And if you don't put your lives on the line now for those basic principles, they won't exist. And if you do, they will. It's as simple as that. The enemies of freedom are very active in this country. They are well placed in positions of academic power. They are also well funded with government funds. I have in my hands the Saskatchewan Law Review, published semi-annually. I have volume 49, and I find on page 303 a book called Hate Propaganda, A Reason to Limit Freedom of Speech. I find in the past that these little law reviews that nobody reads often contain articles which subsequently become the law. In fact, the introduction of the phrase racial and social tolerance in relation to Section 177 does not exist in the law, but it was placed there by an article in the Canadian Bar Review published in 1967. And never since that time, but now in 1985, it was introduced as some kind of new sanctity, you see. It had a real value, weight. So you can't ignore these little books that nobody reads, because they're trial balloons. And if they fly, and if the academics see, here's a new way to do it, you'll find that in time somebody will face a charge under this kind of machination. I find that on page 312, and I call them the enemies of freedom, have found a solution to the problem of Ernst Zundel and James Keegstra. The problem of Ernst Zundel and James Keegstra, they can put forward their views in an open court and can be reported far and wide for what they believe, and believe it or not, a lot of people agree with them, of course very quietly. So the solution is a new and a more insidious method of trial. Here's the answer. You see, the people who argue that these trials are too dangerous because all sorts of bad ideas come out have now put this argument forward, and this man counters the argument by saying this argument fails for several reasons. Assuming that prosecution may be perceived as a benefit by the hate-monger, insofar as it would provide the opportunity to propagate its perverted ideas further, the effect of this perceived benefit could be reduced by conducting such trials in camera. Exactly. But no one has done anything about this suggestion, and it's already being discussed far more widely in the Canadian academic community. You should think about writing to the Saskatchewan Law Review. You should think about writing to the University of Saskatchewan about this kind of thought this idea. If we don't like it, we've got to say so now while we can still speak about it. Because we're living in a ridiculous world. It's a fantasy land of false ideas. It's becoming a world in which the human mind is being selectively deprogrammed of the faculty of reason. We're being taught not to think, not to even consider intelligent use of our minds because we have an official truth. We have a truth that tells us that, for instance, when Dr. Verba says that he saw bodies being burned in pits 6 meters underground in a country that is swampy, in ground that has groundwater below a meter, we ought not to question that. That is truth. We must not even dare to cross-examine or question that. One would be insensitive to doubt that. When we are told by the same Dr. Verba that he saw a man climb on a roof and reach up to such great heights with all his strength and pull himself up, surrounded with cans of Zyklon B, onto a roof, and he's confronted with a building which indicates that the location he described is underground, we are not to laugh. Do not laugh. Do not question. Do not do anything but you must believe. Even though your faculties tell you that there is something dubious about this, you must not disbelieve, you must not question, you must believe, even though your mind tells you not to believe. When, for example, we have stories from the same Dr. Verba of 1,765,000 Jews in 2 years gassed that he knows of, we must not question that, we must again believe. Because to do otherwise might result in the crime of Ernst Zundel. And we must be very obviously aware that that could result in 15 months in prison. That is the society in which we may eventually live if we do not, as citizens, realize that it is our duty to make our members of Parliament aware that we don't want to surrender our brains to our government. We're also told by, for example, Dr. Hilberg, who's an authority on the Holocaust, that although he wrote a book about the subject, he was never in a concentration camp himself, nor did he ever visit one in his research prior to writing the book. Once again, I warn any of you in this audience who laugh that if there are those among us who would like to do something about it, you stand in jeopardy. Because again, we must believe. We must not question. We must not suggest that somehow or other this doesn't sit well with a reasonable mind. We must simply believe. Now, I'm telling you this because a country that puts upon the human psyche that kind of artificiality eventually will destroy everyone in that country. I don't want to be destroyed. I don't want to have to agree with you or disagree with you. I don't want to have to be a slave of state ideology at any time. It must be, in my opinion, open to any individual to decide what they wish to believe and do so freely and voluntarily. Of course, we were also told in the course of the trial by Mr. Phillip that 10 men were hung on one rope before breakfast every morning. And again, we should not laugh, smile, or question. We were told further by Mr. Friedman that we could tell the national origin of the Jews particularly burned on a given day because of the color of the smoke up the chimney. Once again, anyone who doubts, who questions, or even who even might not believe is a very bad person, a criminal. I find that disgusting. My ancestors are not in any way liable to be accused of having an interest in such a matter. But as a free-thinking human being, I don't want to have to suspend my mind and believe such things if my mind tells me as a sober, sensible, peace-loving human being that this is nonsense. I want to be able to say so. That's all I ask. The right to disbelieve the religion of my friends, acquaintances, or perhaps not friends. We have also to believe that although Dr. Hilberg quotes Gerstein 23 times and acknowledges that he was virtually a madman, and that he selected the portions of which he wished to quote, and didn't quote anybody else more than Gerstein, we must accept that too as truth. We must also accept that he relies on a man who he didn't even know had written an autobiography in which he said he was tortured. We must also accept the expert opinion evidence of someone who doesn't produce a single document. We must believe that too. We must ask for never the production of a single scientific report on anything, or a single piece of paper supporting any of his opinions. we must accept the proposition that a doctor from Vermont who teaches political science on a daily basis and wrote a book without visiting a single concentration camp must be accepted as a witness and can put a man in jail for having a contrary opinion without producing a single document or a single piece of paper to verify his own opinion, other than his own writings. If that's the kind of country in which you wish to live, then sit where you are, quietly go home tonight and forget it, because that's the kind of country you'll live in tomorrow. That's the kind of country, it seems to me, we live in today. The kind of country that would treat Voltaire to a term of imprisonment for his disbelief. The kind of country which will ask of everyone nothing but silence, obedience, and a willingness to subvert their own minds in the pursuit of what the government dictates as the official truth. I haven't come very long in this understanding to realize that it does fall upon us to do those things which were really quite harmless and really quite necessary in every society to attain truth, and fundamentally that is to speak out. To speak out to your friends, to speak out to your acquaintances, and to speak out to your members of parliament, and to speak out in public in letters to the editor, and to take the offensive. Recently, for example, in the Western Producer, which is a newspaper in Western Canada that has a circulation of approximately 120,000, they published a letter in which they said, Doug Christie, the Western Canada Concept, the League of Rights, I don't think they named me, they said the leadership of the Western Canada Concept. They did not mention my name. Hate Jews. That's what they said, in effect. So I sued them. So they published an apology. But you know what would have happened if I hadn't sued them? They wouldn't have published an apology. And furthermore, the apology they published is really virtually meaningless, because to 120,000 people, the smear has been made. And someone whose fundamental purpose is to defend the right to think and to speak has been categorized into a category which no one ever is supposed to listen to. And that is the process of intellectual terrorism. And our response must simply be that we will not surrender, and we will fight back at every opportunity, and we will take advantage of the legal system as it gives us some rights. Now, we don't ask the state to pay our bills. I don't ask the state to prosecute anyone. I couldn't possibly suggest that the government of Canada or anyone should protect my right to my reputation. I pay the costs, and I stand possibly to lose everything I have worked for since 1970 as a lawyer. But I will willingly surrender every single penny of it if I have to fight to defend my reputation. And that's what you should be willing to do too. Because if we don't, we will neither have reputation nor any freedom to enjoy it. Today, in Red Deer, Alberta, a man is being fired by a college administration and a gutless provincial government because he did one thing. He came to Toronto and he testified that the little red booklet that I showed you and another book called The Hoax of the 20th Century was useful for his students to understand both sides of an issue. He's being fired because he dared to speak up for the right of students to examine both sides of an issue. And if he's going to be fired, then nobody has any right to rejoice in academic freedom at all. There is none. And you and I could begin by writing tonight to the Attorney General of Alberta and tell them that you've heard about this firing, that you don't approve of that type of treatment of academics. And of course, if he was a communist, there wouldn't be any fear for him. But he's basically in favor of freedom. He doesn't necessarily agree with anything that Ernst Zundel says, or James Keegstra. He simply thinks that they should have a right to their opinions. And he's being fired. And every academic in his college knows the meaning of that. They don't all have to be fired, because they get the message. And if you and I don't defend them, if he has no friends, if people don't stand up and fight now, there won't be anything left for future generations. There won't be anything left of him. The cowards will win. The cowards will win, and nothing will be left for anyone who dares to think. It's obvious that it doesn't take much to write a letter. It doesn't cost you a great deal of money, and there is no excuse for not doing it. You can take the initiative. Somebody told me when I came in here, I find people rather difficult at times. There weren't enough chairs in here. And there were some over there, and there's still some empties here. But somebody said to me, where do I put the chairs? Now, we have become so lazy that we don't use our own brains. You don't need me to tell you where to put the chairs. Put them where the people are. You don't need me to tell you what to do. But I'll tell you, a lot of people find excuses by saying, I don't know what to do. You know what to do. You know, our forefathers knew what to do when they thought their country was threatened. They didn't say, well, should I or shouldn't I, or what should I do now? They fought for their country. We don't have to risk our lives. We don't have to risk our homes, our families, or bloodshed. We have to stand up, speak out, write, and make our views known. Get involved politically with making politicians realize that you will make their lives very uncomfortable if they don't fight for the freedom that you value. Are you going to do that? Well, I think you better. I think we all better get a little alive and a little awake and get going. Because there's nobody else going to do it for us, and if we don't do it, we're going to regret it. The result of the present situation in the world is really the responsibility of every single one of us. I haven't asked of you anything that I wouldn't do myself. I've made a commitment myself to assist those whose freedom to speak is in jeopardy. I'm suggesting that if you have any extra money that you want to spend on a trip to another country or on some frivolous activity, maybe you better think about redirecting it to a cause that's worthwhile in the support of people who are fighting for your freedom of speech. It's a time of difficulty for us. It's a testing time. We look to those who expect, or we had expected would lead us, and we know that they aren't. Many people had high hopes for Brian Mulroney. Had high hopes for Brian Mulroney. Many people thought that all it would take to end the type of government that we had would be to change those people who were there at the time. It's not a renewal at the top that's necessary. It's a renewal right here and right now. I just want to end by saying that it's a privilege that I have really enjoyed to be able to be here to speak to you about... Can I help you? It's all right. There'll be an ample question period. It's important that we realize that we all have a place and all have a part to play. It isn't going to be easy for me, and it isn't going to be easy for those who try, but it'll bring us together. And I was saying to Ron Gostick tonight, we had supper a little earlier, the thing that has happened as a result of the persecution of James Keegstra and Ernst Zundel is that those of us who really value freedom may have known about each other at other ends of the country, or we may have heard about each other, but it has really brought us together in a new and determined commitment to defend those things that are necessary for truth to prevail. All that is necessary in any society for truth to prevail is that all opinions be free to combat in the open marketplace of ideas, and the best result will always be achieved. As Lord Randolph Churchill once said, properly informed, trust the people. The question is, who will inform the people when only the government can speak, or those sanctioned by the government? Then we will have a permanent detour from truth, a permanent swamp of intellectual disgust about what we are and about what government is. I think that's the morass that many socialist states have put their people in. Then they lose the will to fight because they've lost the will to think. And when that happens, it's not so easy to get back to where we are now. Don't think that it's a hard battle today, because if you wait till tomorrow, it's a harder battle then. So the time now is right. It's our duty today. It's our power and ability today. We're richer in youth. We're richer in every way today than we will be tomorrow, in the really important things, the energy and the will to fight. So we must use it now while we still can. Tomorrow may be too late. This is not a process where I can go home and think about it and come back in a month and think, well, then I'll be ready. Now we must be ready. Now we are more ready than we have ever been, and now we are more ready than we will ever be. So now is the time. And if we realize that, and we act on it, we'll make history. We won't be buried under it. Some people say to me, well, aren't you afraid of what might happen to you? My answer is this. I know what will happen to me. Someday I will die, as every single one of us will. But when I do, it will be with the greatest gratitude that while I lived, I lived. When we fight for what is right, we will never, ever be destroyed. No battle is ever lost unless we surrender. And we are the people who have not surrendered the freedoms that others fought and died for. We have not surrendered them yet. We can fight for them, and we will not surrender them in the future. And we will never, as long as we fight, we will never be destroyed. Thank you.